Hello players, today I'm going to talk a little bit about wedges and wedge fittings, the things that I look for when I'm helping players choose what wedges to put in the bag. There's a few different things that go into it, so kind of go through the process now and share with you maybe how to think about it. So the first thing I always do with players is I want to get their specs. So when I say specs, I'm talking about lie angle, which is how much this angle here, to get the length correct, get the shaft profile, the shaft weight correct. And we're usually trying to kind of match them up sort of with their irons. But we just want to get the right size, if you will, size and weight to the clubs. The second thing I like to do is gap the clubs based on their set. So every player's set is unique, different manufacturers. Their clubs are all different lofts, unfortunately. But I take whatever that player's iron set goes up to, say it goes up to a pitching wedge or a gap wedge, whatever that is, and then we decide, okay, how lofty do I want my most lofted one to be? I recommend 60 degrees usually for your highest lofted club. And then depending on what the difference is between, say, a pitching wedge and a 60, then we might fit 2 or maybe 3 clubs into that window and gap them in like 4 to 6 degree gaps. So some players have a 52, 56, 60. Other players might go 50, 55, 60. Others might go 48, 54, 60. As long as those gaps are, between 4 and 6 degrees, you're going to see good separation in your distances and not have any major problems. What we want to avoid is usually gaps of more than 6 degrees starts to become pretty big, and anything less than 4 degrees starts to become somewhat redundant. So step 1, get the specs. Step 2, pick the lofts that we're going to get. And then step 3 is we're going to pick, what kind of grind or bounce we're going to be looking for. So, I fit primarily Titleist wedges. I do have Callaway and TaylorMade available, and they're all great. I like Titleist because they have the most grind options. And when I'm talking about grind or bounce, that's the shape. It refers to the shape and the width and how they shape the bottom of that club there. That's kind of, when they're talking about bounces and grinds, they're talking about the shape of the bottom of the wedge primarily. So bounce, in golf, bounce has a number associated with it. Some are, and that measurement is in degrees, so some wedges have, say, 8 degrees of bounce, some have 4, some have 10, some have 12, and all that number is a measurement of how far the bottom of the club, see if you can see that there, how far the bottom of the club hangs below the leading edge. There's always a little bit of relief. The leading edge is a little bit higher than the bottom of the club when the shaft is vertical. I put that on the ground right there. That means the leading edge, if this club is sitting straight up and down, this leading edge is going to be just a little bit raised up off the plastic board here. If a club had more bounce, let's see here, this one has a little more bounce. We got some tape on the bottom, which I'll show you in a second. Club has more bounce, this is going to be higher, so this one has like 12 degrees of bounce, so the leading edge rests a little higher. This one only has 7 degrees of bounce, so the leading edge rests a little bit lower. There's also the grind. So the number is the bounce, and then the grind is how they camber off different parts of the club. So for example, on this one, I'll get into the grinds. Actually, let me get into the grinds in a second. The reason all this stuff is kind of important is because when we're hitting wedges, a lot of the time, we're hitting the ground or the sand with something other than the leading edge. So for example, if I'm hitting a full regular, let's call it a mid-range lob wedge, 80, 90, 100 yards, something like that, with the face square, kind of making my normal full swing. When I hit the ground, the leading edge, which is this sharp part, is going to be hitting the ground primarily first, and then going to make a divot out of there and dig a hole in the ground right after impact. And you can see, I hit some with the impact tape on there. You can see that the marks on this one are near the front of the club. So this one, when it's hitting this board, primarily the front of that, the sharp edge is leading the way, hitting the board on the way through the grass. However, we don't always hit shots like that, or you probably shouldn't always hit shots like that. A lot of times around the greens, we need to get the club a little bit more open. We need to set it down, give it a little twist so it's open to add some loft or some spin or some speed. Just loft or spin. And when we do that, a different part of the club starts to hit the grass. So this is hitting off a hard plastic board, but you can see when I open this club up like this, so I take it and I open it and I start to hit some higher shots, the leading edge doesn't actually hit the plastic. It's more the back edge. It's this part of it. So that's why the shape of this is important, is because on a lot of different shots around the green, different parts of the club are hitting the turf, and how that club reacts to the turf is a really important thing. So you can see here's a couple of different grinds. Put them side by side. See if you can see a difference there. It's going to be hard with the light. One of them's got a little bit of relief off of this side, and on the back, this one's hasn't had anything ground off of there. So this one's going to play like it has more bounce. The leading edge is going to be in the air a little bit more. Now, why is this all important, right? Who cares? I used to think it didn't matter too, but it does kind of matter. So when I'm fitting for grinds and bounces, what I'm trying to do is combine what the player does with their swing with the conditions they typically play under. And I would say the conditions are a really, really big factor, which is why most of my fittings, I only have about 2 out of 6 or 7 possible grinds. There's only about 2 that I recommend regularly for Colorado, unless something gets a little bit unique. In Colorado, we have what I would call varied conditions, where it can be firm at times, like the turf and the sand can be firm sometimes. Also, the turf can be soft and soggy. Sometimes the bunkers are fluffier, depending on where you play, when you play, which bunkers you're in. There's no, it's not consistent in Colorado. Versus, say, if you were to go to Scotland and you're playing on the old course at St. Andrews, that is going to be really firm turf all the time. Or if you're playing in somewhere in the south, you're playing Augusta National, lucky you, you're playing Augusta National every day. Those bunkers are super, super fluffy and white sand. So your bounce that you would need for those conditions are going to be a little bit different. How it works, though, the bounce, when we're hitting bunker shots or chips and pitches off the ground, the bounce, or this flangey part, is generally what should be hitting the turf. And when it does, let's say this wasn't hard plastic, let's say this was grass, if this club hits the grass with the bounce instead of the leading edge, if it hits it with the bounce, that club is going to descend, it's going to kind of go down, because the grass has some give to it, the turf has some give to it, it's going to kind of get down in there, but it's not going to dig a hole. So imagine this is like a squishy mat. It's going to slide along that turf for a couple of inches, an inch or two, which is great. It's not going to really lose any speed. The leading edge is going to be below the golf ball, so it'll kind of slide through the grass and get under the ball very easily. If the leading edge hits the ground, then it's going to stop real quick. It's going to dig. It's going to jar. So if the leading edge hits the ground sharply, then we have to be perfect. Let me grab the golf ball. So if I'm coming into this ball, I'm hitting a pitch shot. If I don't have enough bounce, or if my leading edge is hitting the ground, I have to basically slide this leading edge here just perfect into this little gap between the ball and the grass, which is pretty tight window. It's not that it's not possible, but it's tough. If we hit the ball too much first, it's going to be a bladed shot. If we hit the ground first, it's going to chunk and the ball is just going to not go anywhere. However, if we get the bounce exposed and hit the grass with this part, then this club is going to hit the ground probably somewhere just before the ball, and it's going to slide for an inch or two under the ball the whole time. And so we can get away with hitting we have a lot bigger window. We could hit the ground right at the ball a little bit early or a lot bit early, and it's all going to work out well because that club is sliding as that turf is giving underneath it a little bit. So that's what the bounce does for us. You might ask yourself, okay, well, bounce is so good, why not just have a ton of bounce? Well, if you have too much bounce, it's going to start to bounce off of it. So if the leading edge is really high in the air and this flange is huge, it might start to actually ricochet off of there. If you're playing on really hard surfaces, that club might ricochet off of there and then back up into the ball, which would be bad. We don't necessarily want that. And we also don't want too little bounce. So All players are like, well, why don't I just try to slide it in there perfect? So they get these like clubs with 4 degrees of bounce that are like basically razor sharp, and they're fine if you are very, very precise. With most people, aren't. I certainly don't want to have to be that precise either. So in Colorado, the grinds and bounces that I recommend are kind of middle of the road. They're kind of the neutral ones. They're good for a variety of conditions, and depending on the player's swing type, whether they're steep or shallow, or they sweep or they dig, all kind of bias one way or the other of those 2 grinds, depending on their swing. But a lot of it is about the conditions. In Colorado, we want something that's versatile and gives you a good enough bounce to get through most bunkers, but not so much that it's bouncing off hard sand or bouncing off, hard surfaces when it gets a little bit dry out here. Anyway, hopefully that makes sense. Kind of a long topic, but hopefully maybe learned a little bit about how wedge fitting works, the gapping works, and most importantly, hopefully how that bounce kind of works through the grass.